probably some of these new missiles, some of this ammunition is getting through now, and the Russians are having to be more careful about what they do.
Former National Security Advisor and UK representative to NATO, Lord Peter Ricketts, joins us now. Good afternoon, Peter.
Hello, Kathy.
Just looking at the summit as a whole, it was sort of nicknamed the lame duck summit because so many of the leaders had, look at Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz. They're all in trouble in some way domestically. Yet, despite that, the G7 has sort of just about pulled together, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it was probably a relief for most of them to be there, actually. Far more fun to be in Bari, if not partying, at least having Michelin-starred cuisine and dealing with issues where basically most people agree.
Bit of a
They've
holiday,
all got
really.
Well, they've got very difficult domestic situations,
Mm.
particularly Rishi Sunak. But on Ukraine, I think there was a unanimity. Giorgia Meloni, although a populist right-wing prime minister, is very strong on Ukraine. And they were able to agree, at least in principle, on this $50 billion using the profits from the assets that Russia has frozen in Europe and America to fund loans to pay back into Ukraine so that it's Russian profits on their money funding Ukraine reconstruction. It's been months and months coming, Kathy. I remember David Cameron coming to talk to our Lords Committee in December saying it was urgent to get this done. So it's taken a long time and it's not yet a fully done deal. It's a sort of issue of principle which now has to be worked through into practice, but it should get some money flowing into Ukraine from early next year in practice.
Come back to that in a second, but just apart from that, the message of sort of democratic unity, given that we've seen the far right making gains across Europe in the European elections, was that on display?
Yes, it was. And if you take France, for example, yes, there was a very strong showing in the European Parliament elections for the far right. But in France, all the foreign policy, security policy levers are in the president's hands. So Macron is not at all put off course by that. And it's one area where they can all agree support for Ukraine, economic support, more military support. This is all in the run up to a NATO summit in a few weeks' time in Washington. So, yeah, this was an area where I think it was pretty easy for that group of 7 leaders to get together and agree.
And what happens? I've seen the deal described, the Ukraine deal described as sort of Trump proof. What does happen if Donald Trump wins? Can he unpick it?
I mean, there are two things going on. There's this $50 billion used from the proceeds of Russian frozen assets. I mean, that I think the idea is to try and get that into legal text, get the loans out there syndicated, get the money beginning to flow before a Trump presidency might come into office. The end of year deadline seems to be not a coincidence from that point of view. There's another thing, which is this 10-year security pact that the US have signed with Ukraine, more arms, more defense cooperation, more training, defense industrial. That 10-year deal feels to me something that a incoming Trump administration could unstitch. So I'm not sure that a bank manager would accept a 10-year deal from an American president facing an election in a few months' time. It's a gesture of solidarity and of determination if Biden were re-elected, but I don't think Zelenskyy can count his chickens on that one yet.
Yeah, not entirely Trump proof then after all.
Not entirely Trump proof. I think the 50 billion, I think it's designed to be partly Trump proof and partly because I think the loans are going to be made by individual countries to be EU proof in the sense that you've got Viktor Orban sitting in the EU who might well try and veto an EU-wide scheme to use this money for Ukraine. But I think by being individual countries underwriting the loans, I think that perhaps tries to get around the EU problem, and then Biden's trying to get around the Trump problem. So this thing is trying to be squeezed in before anybody else can trip it up.
And some in Kyiv had wanted the G7 to release the whole frozen fund of $300 billion. I mean, that was never going to happen, was it? The European Central Bank kiboshed it. But Kyiv can be pretty happy with this, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I think Zelensky's had a good outing there. He's come back with more funds, with a stronger commitment from Biden to continue to support them militarily. Even saw the Pope and had prayers from the Pope. So yes, I think this has been a good outing for Zelensky. I think his appearance at the NATO summit will be tougher for him because there he wants an invitation to join NATO. He won't get the invitation. So he's going to get that no, but it's going to be wrapped up with a great deal of wrapping in terms of as much practical support as possible. And this is a first step towards that, and an important one.
And is there a sign that some of the extra aid that has started to arrive from the US, is there any sign that the tide is being turned in the military offensive? I noticed an interesting article in the Times this morning suggesting that there had been a sort of change in the military strategy that Kyiv was able to deploy.
I think it's beginning to. I mean, I'm not an expert on exactly where the battle is, but I think that sense that the Russians were moving forward, driving the Ukrainians back, that has been halted, I think, or at least slowed. So it's more like a stalemate along the front line, which is certainly better for Ukraine than the idea that they were having to give ground. And I think probably some of these new missiles, some of this ammunition is getting through now. And the Russians are having to be more careful about what they do, because if they mass their troops, then the Ukrainians can attack them. So I think we're beginning to see the effect of that. Yeah, it had an immediate morale boost, I think, on the ground as well.
And just finally, just looking at some of the body language and the kind of, the way Rishi Sunak was greeted by Giorgia Meloni, for example. He's also been pictured with Narendra Modi, but he cut a slightly isolated figure elsewhere, didn't he?
Yes, he did. I mean, I think politicians, they have a sense that, when a colleague is facing elections and they're badly behind, that does change a little bit the body language. Everybody is now waiting to see what happens on the 4th of July. Of course, he had that awkward business about not showing up to the international ceremony at D-Day, being absent from the great photograph with the Western leaders. Yeah, I don't think there's a feeling that he's a guy who's, facing a cliff back home. He's up against it. I was probably enjoying being away from it for a day. But Democratic politicians are very aware of of that sort of background to an individual leader. So I think people are sort of now waiting to see what happens and not probably investing a great deal in relations with Rishi Sunak right now.
And we saw Keir Starmer had put that photo of him and Zelenskyy from the D-Day celebrations in his manifesto already this week. So just a final thought, if you would, in 3 weeks' time, it could be Keir Starmer rushing off to these G7 summits. How do you think he'll handle himself in this kind of international diplomatic field?
Well, I think he's been preparing for it. The NATO summit, I think, starts 4 days after the UK election. So whoever is the new prime minister, if it's he's going to be on a plane very rapidly to Washington and sitting literally alongside the table with Joe Biden at that important summit. 2 weeks later, he's got all the European leaders assembling at Blenheim Palace for a European summit wider than just the EU and the UK. An opportunity for him to convene, to chair the meeting, to come out with a conclusion. So within a month of being in office, I think he will have been established as a leader. We'll see how well he rises to that. But British parliamentarians are usually pretty good at playing a room, organising a discussion, coming out with a consensual text. So I would expect he would do pretty well in that.
Fascinating. Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, thank you very much for joining us.